We're going to turn to politics now, where President Biden held a second meeting with a bipartisan group of lawmakers yesterday about his $2 trillion jobs and infrastructure proposal.
I am prepared to compromise, prepared to see what we can do and what we can get together on. I've noticed everybody's for infrastructure. The question is who's going to pay for it, and that's what we're going to try to work out today.
Joining us now, one of the lawmakers who was in that meeting, Independent Senator Angus King of Maine. Senator, thanks so much. It's good to see you again. Sure. What do you like about the bill, for the state of Maine especially, and where do you think the president, Democrats and Republicans, can actually agree on?
Well, what I like about the bill, especially for the state of Maine and many parts of the country, is broadband. There was general consensus in the room that however you define infrastructure in 2021, broadband is part of it, because for a rural state, we've got 35% of our people who can't connect to telehealth, to remote school, or working from home. So that's a big deal, and I was delighted that was a consensus. So where do we go? Where did the meeting go? There was some agreement. There was agreement that we need an infrastructure bill. The disagreement, oh, by the way, there was also agreement that it had to be paid for. And it seems silly to have to say that, but yeah, everybody said we got to pay for this somehow. So the question is, what is infrastructure? How do you define what goes into the category of the bill? And secondly, of course, how's it paid for? The president's put his proposal on the table, and he asked me to sort of moderate the meeting. I turned to Mitt Romney toward the end of the meeting and said, okay, the president's put his proposal out. I think you guys need to put something on the table yourselves. And Romney readily agreed and said, that's what we're working on.
So, Senator King, the level of cynicism at the prospects of a bipartisan agreement, obviously high. Many Republicans are suggesting that the president's just using them as a prop in the Oval Office again. How does the Democratic plan and a Republican plan meet in the middle if there's a big divergence, especially on the funding side of this?
Well, I think the key to what you just said, Joe, is the word big. How big of a divergence is there, and is there some way to meet in the middle? Yeah, I mean, this is a tough case. Although the president expressly said, "I'm ready to compromise." He wasn't going to negotiate with himself and start lowering his proposal or changing his funding proposal on the spot. But he said, "I'm ready to compromise," and I hope that the Republicans in the room heard that. And because I think that's an opening, and they've got to compromise as well. The issue for the Republicans is that the president has proposed the principal funding mechanism as a sort of snapback of the lowered corporate income tax rates that were passed in the Trump tax cut. They went from 35% to 21%. The president's proposed taking it back up to 28%. The Republicans made it pretty clear that's not going to work for them. Maybe there's a number in between 21 and 28. I'm not going to speculate on that now, but and there were a lot of other discussions about how to pay for it. One of the suggestions I made is there are billions of dollars that aren't collected every year because the IRS doesn't have the wherewithal to go after tax cheats. So there are various options on the table, and I think, I mean, you know, I'm a perennial optimist, but there was a mood in the room that we got to do this, and we really ought to figure out how to do it. And I think the president genuinely wants to do it on a bipartisan basis rather than ram it through on reconciliation or some other sort of simple majority proposal. But both sides have to come to the table.
Right. So do you know one Republican willing to raise taxes, corporate taxes, whether it's from 21 to 22% or 21 to 25%?
I don't know. I don't want to. The answer is yes. I've heard discussion about numbers in between 21 and 25. Nobody has come out and said, I want, you use the word I want to. They don't want to. But I think it's on the table, and we just have to wait and see. I mean, if if we end up with red lines, and I was disturbed last week when some of the Republicans said, you know, the corporate tax is a red line. Well, you can't really negotiate very well if there's a red line. And as I said at the beginning, the Republicans have said, we don't want to raise corporate taxes. Okay, that's the president's proposal. What's yours? And let's see if they come up with something that's in the ballpark, that is enough toward the president in terms of what's in the package and how to fund it, that there can be a deal. If they come back with a lowball deal that really doesn't meet the needs of the country right now, then it's not going to go anywhere. I'm looking and hoping that we can have some genuine, good old-fashioned negotiations.
So, Senator King, it's Willie Geist. Good to see you this morning. Part of the criticism also is not just the raising of taxes, but as Mitch McConnell has said, that yes, we're interested in infrastructure, but $2.2 trillion goes well beyond what most Americans consider infrastructure. Do you believe that there are pieces of this proposed legislation that could be peeled away, perhaps to entice some Republicans into voting for it? Well,
I'm not going to negotiate with myself, but yes, I mean, that was part of that. As I mentioned, there were really two major issues in the meeting. What's infrastructure? And by the way, the administration isn't calling this an infrastructure bill anymore. They're calling it a Jobs Act, because there are provisions like long-term care and housing and others that aren't traditionally, you know, highways, bridges, and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, those are the two areas of negotiation: is what's in the package and how to pay for it.
So, Senator, can you just speak to our audience about sort of the state of politics in the Senate right now and Congress more broadly? I think most Americans now are of the view that Republicans aren't going to vote for anything at this point proposed by Joe Biden or Democrats, that reconciliation is the only way to get big things done. You've been there for a while. How different is it today than you've seen in the past?
Well, I'll be honest with you, Willie. I think the next month or so is going to tell the tale. And the question for me is, are the Republicans going to negotiate and realize that they don't control the Senate, they don't control the House, they don't control the presidency, or are they just going to say no? We're going to obstruct everything? And if they do that, the pressure on people like myself, who've been very reluctant about ending the filibuster or using reconciliation to say, look, we got to get some things done for the American people, starts to build. My belief is that the future of the filibuster is in Mitch McConnell's hands. If it's used as a total obstruction weapon, then I think its days are numbered. If it's sort of the weapon that's in the back closet that you occasionally pull out in extreme situations, and we can do some serious negotiation, I think it's possible. I think this infrastructure bill is a perfect case to see whether the system can work, because there are policy provisions about what's in the bill, but it's really about numbers.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.